So today's topic is detaching from your story. Detaching from your story. Now, of course, the title of today sounds like I'm going to say you need to detach from your story. That is not what I'm saying at all. We're looking at something and we're having a conversation. That's it. You can be attached to a story. There's nothing wrong with being attached to a story, and there's nothing wrong with being detached from a story. At all. At all. Most teachings will say, oh, you better detach from your story, because if you don't detach from your story, then there's going to be something wrong and you will never be spiritually enlightened while you're attached to your story. That is not what I'm saying at all. That is not what we are about here. We're just looking at a topic. We're just looking at a topic. There is no right. There is no wrong. There is no should. There is no shouldn't. There just is what's happening. Take a deep breath. So let's kind of break this down for a moment. Detaching from a story. The first thing that we need to do is look at the second part of that. We don't have to do anything, but we are going to start talking about story, right? For the context of this conversation, we're talking about the stories that you are creating and have created, right? So, the separated self, or you might call it the ego, is addicted to the story. It's not addicted to one story. Well, there is one main story, which is the story of you it's addicted to. But it's addicted to every story. Every story. Every story. There's a story about everything for the ego. Without an ego, there is no story. There just is what appears to happen. There's just what appears to happen. So, what stories are we talking about here? I just said everything has a story. So, you have a story about your past. You have a story about your future. You have a story about your parents. You have a story about your lover. You have a story about your hair. You have a story about your nails. You have a story about what you see on television. You have a story about the light in front of you. You have a story about this lip smacker. You have a story about this nail orange stick. You have a story about this pen. You have the story about this Nicorette gum. You have a story about that, right? You get the point. Now just take this. This is what? A serviette. A napkin. It's a napkin. Serviette. Serviette. So, as soon as you see the serviette, immediately without you even knowing it, there's a story about the serviette. I'm telling you, there's a story about the serviette. Because the story might go, oh, I think about having serviettes or napkins. Sorry, I just keep saying serviettes. In my bag because in the winter, my nose runs all the time. Literally, I went to Pilates this morning. It's cold outside. And I always, as soon as I get to the Pilates studio, I have to get one of these because my nose runs because of the cold. See, story. That's a story. You have a story about a napkin and serviette. Everyone that's watching this right now has a story about this, right? Just as much as you have a story about how the road not taken, I should say, that regrets in your life. I should have asked that person out. I shouldn't have given up on that dream. I should do this. The shoulds, the shouldn'ts, all stories, all stories, all stories. The story that you have created about your body, that's a story. That's a story. So there's stories all over the place, all over the place. Everything is a story. Take a deep breath. So many stories, exhausting, really. Thank you, Caroline. You bring up a really good point. It's exhausting. Well, if you're alive, you're going to have experience. You're going to have experience in stories. Not necessarily. Yes, we are physical bodies. Yes. My stories drive my actions, right, Heidi? It's true about before you even know it. That's true, Carol. Before you even know it, there's a story. Your stories do drive your actions, right? This is how it works. Yes, it's true. I have so many stories. Never thought of it's so many stories. Okay. This is how it works. You ready? Your story creates a belief which influences every action you take. Your story creates a belief which influences action that you take. So, every story is creating a belief. Serviettes are useful. That's a belief. Some people don't have that belief. They're like, that's a piece of paper, and it's a waste of natural resources, right? Sue says, if you went to Pilates story, it's an experience. It just happened. So I went to Pilates today. There is a story with it. There's no doubt about there's a story with it, but it just happened. I'm not attached to the story. There's no one there to attach to a story. But there can be a story. Right? Hello, Steve. Max, I feel there's nothing else but the story, the reality of it. That's what the ego wants to believe. The ego wants to believe without your story. Now, here's the deal. Without your stories, what's going to happen? I'll tell you what's going to happen. If you didn't have a story about a serviette, you could actually experience the serviette for what it was. And it doesn't matter. You don't need to get rid of the story. We're just having a conversation here. So there is a story about the Pilates. For me, the difference is the story isn't really happening to me. It's very difficult to explain. But it's just what's happening. Here, I'll tell you that this is part of the story. Now, I'm not saying you're going to get rid of stories. I will say that the stories definitely tend to calm the F down. So I threw my back, some of you know this, my back out very badly, like 6 months ago. I couldn't go to Pilates. I could barely walk for a few months. I've gained a ton of weight. I'm now starting to go back. So as I was at Pilates today, I'm like, boy, this body needs a lot of work. This body needs a lot of work. I didn't have a story like, oh, I'm bad, something's wrong with me. I didn't have any of that. I'm just like, oh, that's what's happening. This body needs a lot of work. Period. End. That's a story. But I'm not attached to the story. That's just what's happening. Understand? Let's see. Carolyn says the ego dies. Well, the ego doesn't really die, but it's not, it can, but that's for our purposes. The ego just doesn't play a part in this model anymore. Doesn't play a part in that model anymore. Guess I am confusing experience with story. That's okay. So a story always has something that goes with it, a belief system, a conclusion. Don't do this because that means that. There's a conclusion in a story. Experience is just an experience. That's it.
Sorry, voice texting and not coming out right. I'm confusing experience with story. I get it. The work for me is breaking the pattern of not being attached. Yeah, Lynn. Yes. So, which comes back to when the purpose of today's talk is detaching from the story. Detaching from the story. It's not getting rid of the story. It's your relationship to the story. Aha. It's your relationship to the story. And once the relationship to the story starts to change, something begins to change. And it's your association with what you think you are, really. That's really what happens. So you don't have to detach from the story. You just have to see that you are attached to the story. You just have to see that you are attached to the story. Because trying to detach from the story will just be the ego trying to detach from the story. Do you understand? Trying to detach from the story will just be the ego trying to detach from the story. And you won't detach because it's still going to be controlling you. Just notice that there's a story. And see what happens. Take a deep breath.